All right, coming up this week on Breaking Badness, today we discuss get things Dole whipped into shape. Ex-Disney employee charged with hacking menu database. Next up, to the window, to the firewall. For more than 5 years, the UK cybersecurity firm Sophos engaged in a cat and mouse game with one loosely connected team of adversaries who targeted its firewalls. And of course, our fun game, Gold Guidance and Grievances. With that, Breaking Badness is next. Welcome to Breaking Badness, episode number 195, recorded on November 4th, 2024. I'm your co-host, Callie. They see me Dole Whip. They see me Dole Nay, Fensel. With me is co-host Tim, very sophisticated, helming. And last but not least, Taylor, not what we meant when we said you were nuts, Wilkes Pierce. Couldn't do it.
Almost.
Couldn't keep
Almost
it. Sorry, you guys entertained me.
Nothing to apologize for.
Yeah. How we doing?
Woo! Wow. As we record, this election cycle is almost, should I say over? I don't know if it probably won't be over tomorrow or tomorrow night, but
Yeah. And by the
it'll
time
be at least past a significant milestone, which is called Election Day here in the U.S.
and by the time this comes out,
That particular milestone will be passed.
Now,
Who knows
if we
what
were
will know?
past the next milestone, that's the other question.
yeah, we're past Halloween. We'll be past. I gotta take care of stuff on that bookshelf is fake spider webs. I gotta put those away. They got that bag up there to keep out of reach of my kitties, but I can see it up there. I know other people can see it too.
We know people who are Halloween all year type folks. So
Ooh, I
I
like
think
those
you're
people.
probably not, but like we have a colleague at our day jobs who is quite a lot like that.
I think I know who you're talking about. And they're
Mhm.
my
Season
people.
all year round.
I'm into it, but I do the other holidays too.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And Tim, what's your background again for our listeners?
Oh, this is a scene of Seattle, downtown Seattle from, I don't know, I think the 50s or so. I don't know if your city, dear listener, is the same as ours in that it's pretty much unrecognizable from even 20 years ago because there's been so much construction, so many new buildings, but it's fun to look back at what it used to look like. And so much neon. If you're not watching the YouTube version of the podcast, then you don't realize it's just like you'd be forgiven to think it might be part of Las Vegas, but that's just how big American cities used to be. They used to all have tons and tons of neon.
It was our favorite noble gas.
Indeed.
Used to have more glitz and glamour, tuts. We don't have so much of that in this.
You know what, though? It's the next best thing. You can find these 4K videos on YouTube of just walking through the streets of Tokyo. And boy, talk about glitz and bright lights and all of that stuff. It's sensory overload in one sense visually, but it's also like really calming because there's no sound other than just the ambient sound. And there might be some raindrops or something like that, but it's very interesting.
Sounds nice. I gotta
Mhm.
check that out.
Yeah, and then some ad pops up in the middle of it,
Shoot.
which is not great from an ambiance perspective.
Yeah, I was once listening to like a guided meditation. Like there was an ad like right in the middle of it. And then of course, like one of the comments was like, how dare you?
Seriously, that's all kinds of wrong.
Yeah, it's just I was like, I was in it and then I was right out of it again. But to that YouTuber's credit, they did fix it. They're like, oh, my mistake. So sorry. So we're human.
You can pick where the ads go.
I don't do YouTube as like a personal thing. So I don't really know the game of it all where it's like you can pick where the ads go. But I think you can turn off, at least not put it right in the middle. You make maybe before is the choice, before or during. I don't know. If you're a YouTuber,
Let us know.
yeah, let us know.
Let us know.
Because now I know we could Google it. Someone tell us. We like to chat. But yeah, we'll pivot into infoseccy things now. And why don't we get some things Dole whipped into shape? I think that sounds good. So in what feels like a plot from a science fiction novel, an ex-Disney employee allegedly used old credentials to hack into Disney systems to change restaurant menus in an act that could have turned deadly. So, Taylor, we're not talking about removing Dole Whip from the menu or changing the shape of Mickey Mouse waffles, but let's start at the beginning. So, Michael Schurer, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, was charged with violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act on 3 occasions. Can you summarize what that act is for listeners?
The CFAA
Yeah.
is a pretty broad federal law that gets involved whenever you're committing crimes with a computer that's not yours.
Okay.
Don't break somebody else's computer.
Okay. So you can break your own computer, but you cannot break other people's computer.
Don't use yours to break someone else's. That's
Don't do
don't do it repeatedly.
Do
Three
it
times.
Don't do it on 3 separate occasions. Don't
Don't
do
do it
that.
on 3 separate occasions. Don't do it on 1 separate occasion. Do not do it. So in this case, the CFAA is invoked because our friend here
Our
broke
friend.
our, our our topic here decided to break laws in multiple jurisdictions. So that gets the federales involved and the person alleged here. So obviously this person's not been convicted. So we'll stick to the allegations that have been laid out by our FBI agent here. But they were let go from their job as like menu builder at the inside of a very large theme park company that the complaint it refers to as Company A. So we'll call it Company A. Company A has lots of restaurants in multiple places in like California and Central Florida. And because they have so many, they have centralized their menu production systems. And this individual who is alleged to have committed these crimes had previously worked as a menu production manager, making sure that I guess all the menus get to the right places at the right times and include all of proper ingredients and allergen information. And so this person was let go from their position and then went on a bit of a spree, both physical and cyber. So this is not just, hey, they were messing around with the menu system, but the FBI alleged that they broke in on 3 separate occasions. The first time they broke into the back-end menu system, they just replaced their fonts with Wingdings fonts.
What would be worse, Wingdings or Comic Sans?
Ooh.
I mean,
Comic Sans, you can get something useful across. I feel like
I know, but it's also soul destroying.
yeah, it is. Yeah, especially if you're in the happiest place on earth.
I mean, that's just so bizarre. It would be, I don't know, I'd find it slightly amusing.
Yeah,
Anyhow, continue.
I was going to ask, is there any significance to changing fonts to Wingding symbols, or is it just for chaos?
Wingdings is a font just filled with iconography,
Right.
icons. There's no, you can't make heads or tails out of it. So again, Comic Sans would be very funny if everything was Comic Sans for the day without anybody knowing. Everything being Wingdings for the day broke everything. Instead, right? So that was the first intrusion, was the Wingdings intrusion.
Very subtle, let me say. By the way, there's probably someone out there who has actually memorized the Wingdings to alphanumeric translation and could, like, somebody probably has the superpower of reading Wingdings, but whether they went to one of these restaurants at the time where their superpower would have been the thing, it's unlikely.
They could have gone on vacation on that one day. And everything.
Everybody thought I was crazy for memorizing this.
But no one knows how to order the Dole Whip. I'm the only one.
Yeah. Now who's the crazy one?
Not content with just messing about with the fonts. Our criminal here, our threat actor here, decided to get back in. Decided to get back in. And at that point, they started adjusting some of the like allergen information on the menus. And in this case, the Company A managed to catch this before any of these things were printed and put out in parks. But yeah, they were messing with the QR codes as well to change them over to a kind of a hacktivist looking website of things. So it might have been more of a throw someone off the trail deal. And so that was the second, was when they hopped in and this individual messed around with the QR codes to try and also to remove some of the allergen information. And then this person, again, not content with those, they decided to catch these 3 charges to essentially perform a denial of service attack on specific accounts that they work with in their organization to keep them from logging on. So they managed to get in between. They wrote a little script that tried to log on to these accounts over and over again and then put them temporarily out of commission. My favorite part about this last intrusion is that when the FBI showed up at the front door to arrest them, they were actually like the denial of service was going on. And they said that it ceased at 12:46. This individual was arrested at 12:48 p.m. The heroes in our story, they're very detail oriented.
Wow.
So yeah, that's the kind of the story behind this.
Yeah.
When they dorked with the QR codes, this is interesting because as an attack method, there's two different ways you could do it. One is you supply a different QR code that goes to the site that you want them to go to, or the other is you mess with the server that the QR code is properly pointing to, but that server is now hacked and doing something different. I'm guessing in this case, it was the first one. They probably put in different QR codes. Is that
put a new QR code in. That is correct. But yeah. I mean, when you think about all the QR codes that started appearing on restaurants 4 years ago, now I wonder how many of those domains are still around.
It's a huge attack surface.
And not that it justifies any of those actions, but do we know anything about Schur's layoff? Doesn't sound amicable.
Again, not amicable. It's also notable that the threat actor here was also physically visiting people. So he was creeping around some of the victims' houses. Yeah.
Okay.
Not good.
Camera.
Great.
Yeah, it's maybe it wasn't all there, but we don't really get a whole lot of detail on it.
No, we do know though that the restaurant portion of these menus, it's a third party that created that system for company A.
Yes. So company A employs a third party. Yep.
So was that third party meant to remove the credentials of Schur when he was laid off?
It's possible, but also it looked like he had backdoor access on the SFTP server. He made a new account for himself that they had not caught until the IR teams. And so in addition to our federal or FBI agents here, the IR teams at Company A also did a lot of the legwork and figuring out exactly when things were accessed from where, what VPN service was used, the same VPN service that was also used by the threat actor on their home device when it was seized by the FBI. So just a lot of things add up in the complaint here against the defendant.
What do you think organizations can do to prevent something like this happening? So you got somebody that's a little unpredictable is probably the nicest word to use. And then you're working with a third party. So is there anything from a domain and DNS standpoint that could be done to protect an organization's assets?
Insider threat stuff is really tricky because they're starting from a certain level of access that generally you see a lot of phishing and domain and used to gain that initial access. These folks are starting from third base and it's going to run home. So that's a little trickier. This particular incident doesn't give us a lot of detail. It's tough to see where the breakdown is on the third, but clearly access was kept by this employee post their employment. So that right away,
the big thing is that somehow the account wasn't shut down, or there was some previous account that they didn't shut down at the time of termination or whatever. Yeah.
So what other accusations? So I guess that those are the three though. Is he facing anything else?
You would think the stalking part might enter into this, right? It's not part of the technology story here, but from a criminal perspective, that seems not great for our defendant.
They can always go back and add more on.
That's very interesting stuff. This story's got a little something for everybody. There was a beloved park, Company A. There was insider action. Yeah, there was something for everyone. It was very interesting, but we've reached probably the point where we can assign this a hoodie rating. So if you are a newer listener, what we like to do after we talk about these pieces is talk about what the level of a threat it is, from 1 to 10 hoodies. If you can imagine a stereotypical hacker in a hoodie, 10 being awful, end of days, and 1 being not so bad. You can continue on with this information, just learning from it. But since Taylor, we heard from you, Tim, what are you thinking hoodie wise for this scenario?
Yeah, I don't think this gets a lot of hoodies because it doesn't represent, the attack vector was not a big vulnerability in a big system that a lot of us are relying on. That's an unpatched vulnerability or something like that could make it a pretty high hoodie rating. They didn't do a good enough job of shutting off access to this insider once they became an outsider. And granted, I understand that in big companies, that may not be as easy as it seems, because there could be multiple accounts that the person holds for different reasons and whatnot. It may not be as simple as there's just one account, turn it off. But still, that's not necessarily something that is a big threat to companies that are handling this well. I don't know. I'll put me down for 1.5 hoodies, I think.
Okay. Yeah, that seems fair. Taylor, you're nodding. Are you in agreement with
Yeah,
that?
I feel like this could be in a very real way. This is a hoodie list. So this is Central Florida. No one's throwing a hoodie on. As a Florida native, I can tell you not a lot of hoodies going around Orlando.
But is it a place where they do, unlike those of us in the northern tier of the nation, like they'll put on a hoodie if it gets below 63 degrees?
If it's under 70, yeah, you're right. If it gets under 70, they might throw a hoodie on. Seeing that this involved an SFTP server made me think a lot about like legacy clients and stitching together for how long company A has been around, right? You've got these kind of legacy access clients and these solutions that may be getting the job done for complex scenarios, but leave you a little open to your insider threat, as they may not be accounted for when you're looking at who's got access to what. So that here, seeing the words SFTP server made me think that, but it has to do with printing. So printing always has like really old, really weird drivers. It's like, from a hoodie perspective, it's not the scariest thing. We'll call, yeah, I think 1.5 is great. Well, 1.5 is great. But when you think about, hey, they could have swapped out all the nut allergen information for any period of time. Had they done that first versus trying to make everything Wingdings, then this may be a little bit sadder and more tragic story.
Yeah, for sure.
I
And
agree.
with connectedness, there is a higher implied hoodie just to the background level of the world we live in, the attack surface that all these connected things offer. At first, during the pandemic, when contactless was a thing in restaurants, where there were restaurants that were open, the QR codes were generally printed on paper. It was a somewhat static thing. It would have been harder, obviously not impossible, but it would have been a little harder for somebody to change those, especially remotely. But now everything's on these little kiosks that are at your table. Those have QR codes on them and whatnot. And so we've invited this big expansion of the attack surface into our world, and funky stuff is going to keep happening.
I would agree that the allergen portion would have made this
Yeah.
a lot different. I did hear peanut M&Ms are the most, because we're just right by where Halloween just was, they're the healthiest candy, except on SNL when they said, except for the people that it's deadly if they touch it.
Right.
Could have been very different, but a very interesting story to discuss. But thank you, Taylor, for walking us through that. We got to talk about our second article today, which is To the Window to the Firewall, which is Sophos reveals how intensely and for how long they battled one group of hackers who sought to exploit their products for their own advantage. So, Tim, get us started. For those who might not know, who is Sophos?
Yeah, Sophos they've been around a long time. They're one of the longest lived cybersecurity companies on the planet. I think their history goes back close to 4 decades. And I first got to know them as what was at the time, I thought, and I think other people that knew what was going on thought they were really among the best of the home antivirus offerings. And I ran Sophos AV for many years on my own machines, but they expanded quite a bit. I think that's what put them on the map. They did a variety of different security products almost from the beginning. Some of those were more B2B, some of them were more B2C, but now they've got a big footprint in the network security. They do security appliances, virtual appliances. They do network appliances that aren't pure security, like WAN optimization and stuff like that. So they've become a very large, very successful company in the industry. And I've known some folks, really good people. They're a stand-up company, and this article that we're going to talk about is a good example of that.
Do we know how this all began? Like how they found out they were being infiltrated?
Yeah, and for folks that are listening to this, I really recommend that you read the article that we link. It's Andy Greenberg, reliably awesome Andy Greenberg, of course, in Wired. And then he is referring to the very thorough report that Sophos also published with several sort of subcomponents, the summary of what it was, the timeline, IOCs, all the things you could hope for from a report like this. But so how did this all start? It goes all the way back to 2018. And as I mentioned, part of how Sophos grew was through acquisitions. They acquired a network security company called CyberRoam, which was based in India. And it was in a CyberRoam office that they noticed that there was a machine that was acting strangely. It was conducting a bunch of scanning. And this was a machine in their environment that shouldn't have been doing that. It was like a display driving device or something like that. So they took a closer look and realized that a backdoor and rootkit had been implanted. This was called Cloud Snooper at the time, and probably even by our standards today, a fairly sophisticated, basically, snooper is the right way to put it. It was used for reconnaissance and espionage and whatnot. And the thinking is that a large part of what that was attempting to do was to gain more inside information on these widely popular devices, which became part of some of the attacks that carried on. So then the action moves forward a couple of years to 2020, spring of 2020, when there was a malware that they called Asnarok, which is a play on Ragnarok, but it used a SQL injection vulnerability. Through the course of this, by the way, let me stop and say there were a number of vulnerabilities in Sophos devices that were exploited. Now, we have to understand Sophos is far from the only vendor. Probably you can safely say just about every network security vendor has had vulnerabilities. So it's not really a black eye on them. This is just the reality of connected computing devices. But there were some vulnerabilities that were exploited. And so in April of 2020, there was a fairly widespread attack on these devices to deploy a Trojan. And in that same time frame, in April of 2020, researchers from the Sophos XOps team, which is a threat hunt team, and they're very good. They're probably analogous to Cisco Talos. They found a device in the city of Chengdu, China, which seemed to be where some of the testing of these exploits was going on. So they localized the origins of the attack back then. A little later on in 2020, a different kind of attack exploiting a different vulnerability started going after these Sophos devices again. One of the things, by the way, about internet firewalls, and we've talked about this before, but it's been a while, is you have to administer these things, right? You have to write the rules to them and monitor them and all of that. And in a perfect world, you're doing that from the LAN side, from the inside of the network. But especially with the move to work from home and whatnot, and the massive disruption to the shape of the ecosystem, a lot of devices have WAN side access as well. So you can log into the firewall from the exterior world and do those things that you have to do. Now, of course, that raises the risk level. There are things you can do to mitigate that risk. Obviously, things like strong passwords and whatnot, two-factor authentication whenever it supports it, even putting the firewall device behind a VPN concentrator that itself has strong security. There's things you can do, but this attack was taking advantage of the fact that there were a lot of devices on the network that did have the WAN side portal exposed. And so we're into getting toward the summer of 2020, continuing to see different kinds of vulnerabilities exploited at the same time. And by the way, along the way, through this whole timeline, Sophos was doing a great job of patching these vulnerabilities. They stayed on top of this and they got patches out to their customers quickly. But it was a cat and mouse game. It was ongoing. They started the telemetry that Sophos started to get, which was really clever. In July of 2020, they deployed a little implant of their own, which started collecting telemetry off of their devices and understanding more about the attackers who were carrying all of this out. But they narrowed it down to a specific individual. Of course, they can't attribute it to an actual human name, but somebody that went by an alias of T. Stark. And this was at a specific university in Chengdu, China. So anyway, they started to get more confident in attribution. Meanwhile, we are still seeing attacks against Sophos devices. There were basically two kind of categories of these attacks too. One of them was trying to compromise Sophos devices to use them as what they called online relay boxes, ORBs, which was just as a jumping off point to do other things, either across the internet, or in some cases, looking at the LAN side, so the inside of the device that they had compromised. You started to see victimology emerging in summer of 2020. A Tibetan organization was one of the ones that was attacked. Sophos got together with the folks at Volexity, and they helped this Tibetan organization deal with all of this. But you continued through 2020 into 2022, continuing to see different vulnerabilities exploited. These attackers used a lot of sophisticated techniques as far as obfuscating the presence of the code that they had implanted, defeating some of the telemetry that ordinarily would have shown that something strange was going on. They were living off the land on the devices, as well as, of course, on devices that they had compromised behind them. And also, they got close to successfully installing a bootkit, which would have made it even harder. And that was getting more recent. That was discovered, but August of 2022. The development of this UEFI bootkit, which would have potentially made it hard for the user to recover from that without physically going and installing a clean image off of a USB device. So as soon as you can't update your device over the network, that becomes harder. Anyway, so throughout 2022 seems to have been really the big year when a lot of the exploits and then subsequent patches of these exploits were done against these Sophos devices. But you could see, as you read through the timeline, you can see step by step how, as the attacker does something new, Sophos responds, patches new vulnerabilities, et cetera. They also helped customers who were running out of support devices. This is a big deal in network security, by the way. These devices aren't cheap. It's tempting to keep older devices if they seem to be working fine and not upgrade to the newest and latest. And so sometimes you're running devices that are a little bit or a lot out of their window of support, end of life. And this is a real tricky thing for vendors too, because there's a big cost associated with supporting end-of-life devices. On the other hand, it's a mission-critical security device. And in some cases here, Sophos elected to go ahead and issue patches to devices that otherwise wouldn't have gotten patches because they were end-of-life. They seem to have really been working closely with their customers throughout the whole process. Sometimes just broadly, everybody who had a Sophos device, sometimes specifically working with customers who were targeted by these threat actors.
And do we know who the primary targets of these threat actors were? Was it
Yeah.
Sophos themselves, or?
Yeah, no, only insofar as it was a way to get access to what were probably the real targets. So the victimology, it seems to be chiefly South and Southeast Asia. And within that, it's the kind of groups that you would expect in a geopolitical espionage type of attack. So government, critical infrastructure, those kinds of outfits, military as well. So yeah, that seems to have been the primary victimology. Now, later on, they did discover some separate attacks against non-Asian entities as well, which seemed to be a completely independent group, much smaller in scope, but that was also exploiting Sophos devices to some extent. But the vast majority of what they're talking about here, in fact, the whole title of their summary of this is Pacific Rim. Specifically, it was mostly Asia focused.
And why at this point is Sophos sharing the story? Is this war, it's like this 5-year-long war, considered over at this point? Is Sophos able to declare a victory?
Sophos is way too smart to put up the big mission accomplished banner and declare this whole thing finished, right? And they made some reference to the fact that to the extent that this continues going forward, they will continue to document it in the way that they have so far. Now, the end of the timeline that they give us, if you read their article, the last sort of event specifically in that timeline was in November of 2023, so almost a year ago, like late November of 2023. They don't give us insights into any specific attacks that have happened since then or vulnerabilities. They did say, as they should, that their disclosure of what's going on is also subject to not wanting to disrupt any law enforcement operations that are ongoing, probably more than, if you read between the lines, probably not just law enforcement, but international cooperation, et cetera. So the story is almost certainly not over, but it seems to be in a quieter place as far as active exploitation of Sophos boxes, as far as we can tell.
So what do these findings mean for the industry as a whole?
So I think it's a couple things. First of all, full kudos to Sophos. I said that before, but they are really setting an example here by saying, look, we're not going to hide from the fact that our devices have vulnerabilities. They gently point out that they're not the only ones in this industry that have had this problem, but they're not throwing stones and they're not making excuses. They're just saying, look, this is the reality we're all living in. And we want to be as transparent about this as we can for the sake of basically our customers and folks in the industry who need to be aware that this is a problem. And we've always joked about there are two kinds of companies, the ones who know that they've been attacked and the ones who don't know it yet or been compromised. And it's the same, I think, for the firewall vendors. If you're running firewall devices that are not Sophos, that doesn't mean that there isn't a risk that these devices could be compromised or could have been compromised already. Chances are you probably have applied patches for some potentially pretty serious vulnerabilities. And we've talked in the past, we've named a couple of different vendors that really had very big problems this way over the years. So any security vendor that's in the business long enough is going to have vulnerabilities that get exploited. And Sophos did a great job of talking openly about that and about what they're doing about it. So what these findings mean for the industry to me is A, your devices are vulnerable in ways that you may not like to think about the fact that they are, but they are. And B, it does a service to the industry to come clean the way that Sophos did here and talk openly about what's going on.
Thanks, Tim, for walking us through that. I don't know if a hoodie rating for this is appropriate. Do you think it's
I think it is.
do
I
you
don't
think
know. I mean, yes, they probably have closed the vulnerabilities that we know about right now, but the implications of what this means more broadly, I think, are certainly hoodieable.
I was thinking, like, is this more of a goodie because of
Yeah, you're right. It's both. It's
it's
certainly
winnable?
some goodies to Sophos for what they've done here. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Maybe let's approach it from the hoodie perspective then, though. So we'll start
So
with
do
Tay.
you want, I was going to say, you want me to go
I will
first?
start with Tay.
Okay.
To give hoodies. I'm here to assign hoodies.
Yeah.
I thought what was really interesting about this was the Sophos kind of deploying the specific images to hack back's not the right way to say because it's not really right, but to gain back a little more information to tip scales back in their advantage a little bit, and what it tells us about the Chinese commercial threat intel market, the vulnerability market, like where these things are at. That stuff is super fascinating to learn about from a like hoodie perspective. This is 5 years of breaking into a pretty popular firewall vendor. So yeah, it's got to be pretty. We'll go 6.23 hoodies.
All right. What about you, Tim?
Yeah, there are implications there are things we didn't even have time to go into. We wouldn't unless we were doing a whole show just on this, but having to do with the ecosystem in China of the development of vulnerabilities and then the way that those are used and distributed probably to multiple APT groups. There were 3 different of those groups that were identified in this one, APT 41, 31, and Volt Typhoon, which we talked about not too long ago. So that in itself is, Andy Greenberg could write a whole book about just that, these different.
Come on, Andy.
And whatnot. Yeah,
What are
are
you
you doing? I could easily see this being the nucleus of a forthcoming book from him at some point, which would be a great read, no doubt. But yeah, given the fact that there are undoubtedly some of these kinds of vulnerabilities in other network security appliances, it's scary. I'm with Tay. I'll say 6 hoodies. And the advice here is, especially as the pandemic network topology has been with us for a while, and we're starting to move to a post-pandemic network topology in some cases where people are coming back to their offices and you might have a little bit more of a sense of a perimeter in the traditional sense. But if you have your management interfaces for your network security appliances open to the internet, please take every precaution that you possibly can to secure those things because somebody's banging on that door all the time.
Thank you to you both for sharing your hoodie ratings and Tim for walking us through that. I think we've reached the end of the episode. But before we go, we got to do our gold guidance and grievances. Again, if you're a newer listener, we like to close these out with sharing something good from this past week, something that we feel would be good advice, and then, of course, something that's bothering us. And we also like to do it in reverse order because, of course, ending on something annoying is hard to come back from. So it's gold guidance and grievances, not in that order. And Tim, so we just heard from you. Taylor, we'll start with your gold guidance and grievances.
Yeah, for sure. Let's see. So grievances will go first. My personal grievance, and this has been going on for a few months now, but Google Chrome is killing the uBlock origin ad blocker. They're moving to a new type of blocking experience, which I can probably guess won't be great for the users. I don't know. So I grieve the loss of probably a great security tool, right? Like,
Yeah.
from a guidance perspective, I saw a really interesting article written by someone who runs a Tor node, exit node, and they mentioned that someone is out there spoofing Tor exit nodes in internet traffic to get them put onto abuse lists. So they're out there sending out packets with fake from information from allegedly from these nodes that are abuse packets, and they're getting picked up and blocked. So I thought that was interesting for anyone who might run one of those, that they're probably going to end up getting a abuse contact thing in the mail. And then from a gold perspective, this happened late last week, but there was a multilateral global cooperation in taking down a couple of info stealers, the infrastructure behind the Redline info stealer and the Meta info stealer. The Dutch cops and the US cops got together and knocked back the infrastructure for those and published the names of the developer of the Redline stealer. So a fella in Russia, shocking, I'm sure, for everyone. They were able to catch him because they logged into their iCloud accounts to play games on the same devices that they were logging into their Redlines. So that's fun. That's our gold for the week.
Honorable mention to the multiple takedowns that have been occurring to disinformation sources as well. There's been several of those recently.
Absolutely. Tim, what about your gold guidance and grievances?
I was going to say we're in a stressful time right now, so I was going to very deliberately skip any grievance this week just to keep the mood a little bit lighter. But I will say that I'm fully in agreement with the grievance about the killing of uBlock Origin. Guidance, as I alluded to this stressful time that we're in, there's an article on Ars Technica about 3 science-backed strategies to rein in election anxiety. So check that out. It's a good idea if you're feeling anxious about things, as so many of us are. I, by the way, plan to not spend Tuesday glued to news sources, because whenever you see every little seesaw of how things are going, it's just another cortisol hit that I just don't need. So I'm going to probably Netflix and chill on Tuesday. I've done my duty. I've voted, and now it's in other people's hands. And my gold, nothing to do with InfoSec at all. And it's bittersweet gold because we had a passing of a legend just yesterday or early today or something. Quincy Jones, an amazing musician and producer who was behind some of the biggest hits in the history of music. And I completely coincidentally actually bought a thrift store Quincy Jones record over the weekend and put it. So check him out. That's some built-in guidance, but salute to Mr. Jones, who was just one of the greatest of all time.
Absolutely. And thank you for Rashida Jones as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a solid family right there. But yeah,
For
fantastic.
sure. I actually know his half brother a little bit as well, who's a super cool guy. He's a judge in the Seattle area.
I know Quincy Jones did a Rolling Stone interview a couple years ago that was like, it's not, I don't know if you call it like a tell-all, but it was just like very raw.
It
Like,
was very raw, yeah.
so yeah, very good stuff. But I completely agree with you on sticking away from the grievances if we can. We got to stay.
There's plenty of things to have grievances about, but we can get back to that on the next episode.
Yeah, of course, this is coming out
after.
Yeah.
But we can use these things long after election anxiety.
That's right.
All right. Thank you to you both for sharing your insights. They're always incredibly interesting to listen to. I think our audience is gaining a lot of knowledge from that. And thank you to our listeners for coming back week after week and hearing us. We greatly appreciate it. And we will catch you again next week for another all new episode of Breaking Badness. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye, y'all.
Bye.
That's about all we have for this week. You can find us on Twitter @DomainTools. All of the articles mentioned today will be included in our blog post, which can be found at blog.domaintools.com. Catch us every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific Time when we publish our podcast and blog. That's it for this week. We'll see you again next week on another episode of Breaking Badness. Until then, remember, don't drink and click.